The courtroom went dead silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. Julian Thorne didn't just walk into the Superior Court of New York. He strutted, wearing a $3,000 smile and holding the hand of his pregnant mistress, Bianca. He thought the game was over. He thought his billions, his high-priced lawyers, and his arrogance had already bought him the victory. He looked at his wife Alice and saw a broken woman. But he wasn't looking at the bench. He wasn't looking at Judge Harrison Sterling, a man who didn't care about bank accounts, only facts. And he certainly wasn't looking at the sealed manila envelope in the judge's left hand, a thin packet of paper that was about to turn Julian's smile into a scream. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a theatrical flair that seemed entirely out of place for a divorce hearing. It was November 14th, a dreary Tuesday in Manhattan, but inside the climate-controlled walls of the legal system, the temperature was about to skyrocket. Julian Thorne, CEO of Thorne Logistics, and the newly minted darling of the tech shipping world, entered the room as if he were stepping onto a yacht. He was a man who took up space. Standing 6'2" with hair greased back in a style that screamed old money, despite his wealth being entirely new, Julian radiated an untouchable aura. He wore a bespoke navy suit, cut sharply to emphasize his broad shoulders, the kind of suit that cost more than most people's cars. But it wasn't the suit that drew the collective gasp from the gallery. It was the woman on his arm. Bianca Vore. She was 24, exactly half the age of the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table. Bianca was draped in a crimson dress that hugged her noticeable baby bump, a calculated fashion choice designed to be a weapon. In family court, bringing a mistress was considered poor taste. Bringing a pregnant mistress to the final asset division hearing was an act of nuclear warfare. Julian guided Bianca to the front row of the gallery, right behind his defense table. He leaned down, whispered something into her ear that made her giggle a sharp, piercing sound that echoed off the high ceilings and kissed her on the cheek. He then turned, caught the eye of his wife, Alice, and smirked. It was a smile of pure, unfiltered cruelty. It said, "I have replaced you. I have won. You are nothing." Alice Thorne sat frozen. She was a woman of small stature, dressed in a simple charcoal grey blazer that had seen better days. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. To the onlookers, she looked defeated. She looked like the quintessential discarded first wife, the woman who had scrimped and saved while her husband built an empire only to be traded in for a newer model the moment the stock price hit triple digits. "Mr. Thorne," the bailiff warned, eyeing the display with distaste. "Take your seat." Julian winked at the bailiff, a man named Officer Miller, who had seen it all and slid into the leather chair next to his attorney, Marcus Kane. Marcus was a shark in a suit, known in New York, legal circles as the Butcher, for how he carved up spouses in divorce settlements. "Ready to wrap this up?" Julian whispered to Marcus, loud enough for Alice to hear. "I have a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin at 1. I don't want to be late." "It'll be quick, Julian," Marcus assured him, organizing a stack of files that looked like a skyscraper compared to Alice's single thin folder. "She has no leverage. The prenup is ironclad, and with the baby on the way, the court will favor your need to retain liquid assets for the growing family." "Good," Julian grunted, adjusting his silk tie. At the other table, Alice's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Jenkins, leaned in toward her client. Sarah was not flashy. She didn't have billboards in Times Square like Marcus did, but she had a reputation for being meticulous, a legal surgeon who cut where it mattered. "Don't look at them, Alice," Sarah whispered softly. "Let him peacock. Let him feel safe. Arrogance is the best anesthesia before the surgery." Alice nodded, taking a slow, shaky breath. He brought her Sarah. He actually brought her. "I know," Sarah replied, her eyes narrowing, as she glanced at Bianca, who was currently checking her makeup in a compact mirror, oblivious to the solemnity of the court. And that was his first mistake. "All rise," Officer Miller bellowed. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Harrison Sterling emerged. The courtroom shuffled to its feet. Judge Sterling was a legend in the New York family court circuit. He was a man of 60, with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to possess X-ray vision. He had zero tolerance for theatrics, and even less for liars. He adjusted his robe, sat down, and peered over his reading glasses. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked straight at Julian Thorne. Then his gaze drifted to the gallery landing squarely on Bianca in her red dress. His brow furrowed slightly, a micro-expression of disapproval that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Be seated," Judge Sterling commanded, his voice a deep baritone that demanded absolute attention. He opened the file in front of him. "We are here for the final judgment in the matter of Thorne versus Thorne, division of assets, alimony determination, and finalization of the dissolution of marriage." Sterling looked up. "I trust both parties have submitted their final financial disclosures." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus Cohn said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "We have provided full documentation. Mr. Thorne has been more than generous in his settlement offer, considering Mrs. Thorne's lack of contribution to the company's success in the last decade." Alice flinched. Lack of contribution. "And the plaintiff?" Judge Sterling asked, looking at Sarah. "We have submitted our evidence, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady, "including new exhibits regarding the defendants, unique financial accounting and lifestyle choices." Julian chuckled audibly. He leaned back, crossing his legs. He felt invincible. He had hidden the offshore accounts in the Caymans under shell companies named after his childhood pets. He had transferred the intellectual property rights to a trust in Bianca's name just 3 weeks ago. He was 5 steps ahead, or so he thought. "Mr. Thorne, Judge Sterling," said his voice, cutting through Julian's internal victory lap. "I see you have brought a guest today." Julian stood up, flashing that charming smile that had wooed investors for years. "Yes, Your Honor. This is Bianca Vore, my fiancée, and the mother of my future son." A ripple of whispers went through the courtroom. "Fiancée," Judge Sterling repeated the word, tasting like vinegar in his mouth. "While you are still legally married to the woman sitting 10 feet away from you. Technicalities, Your Honor." Julian waved his hand dismissively. "The marriage has been dead for years. Bianca represents the future. I thought it important she be here, as the ruling affects our child's welfare." "The welfare of the child," Sterling echoed. He picked up a pen and tapped it rhythmically against the bench. Tap, tap, tap. Interesting choice of words. Sterling looked down at a specific document on his desk. It wasn't the financial report. It was a sealed envelope with the logo of Helix Gen Labs stamped on the corner. "Very well," the judge said, his face unreadable. "Let us proceed. But be warned, Mr. Thorne, in my courtroom, the future is often determined by the secrets of the past, and today the past has quite a bit to say." Julian sat down, whispering to Marcus. "What is he talking about, old man, is senile. Just standard judicial posturing." Marcus dismissed it. "Focus on the money." But Alice wasn't looking at the money. She was watching the judge's hand, which was now resting protectively over that sealed envelope. For the first time that morning, a tiny ghost of a smile touched her lips. To understand why the air in courtroom 4B was so thick with tension, one had to understand how Julian and Alice Thorne had arrived at this precipice. 15 years ago, there was no Thorne logistics. There was only a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Queens and a mountain of student debt. Julian was a charismatic, but scatterbrained visionary, with big ideas about supply chains and automated shipping. Alice was the grinder. She was a brilliant actuary, with a mind for patterns and risk assessment. While Julian pitched investors and charmed clients at dinners he couldn't afford, Alice sat at the kitchen table until 4 a.m., coding the logistical algorithms that would eventually become the backbone of the company. She wrote the business plan. She balanced the books. When they couldn't make payroll in 2014, she sold her grandmother's jewelry, the only inheritance she had to keep the lights on. They were partners in every sense of the word. But as the company grew, the dynamic shifted. Julian became the face of Thorn Logistics. Magazines called him a solo genius. He stopped correcting them. He started attending galas alone, claiming Alice wouldn't enjoy the networking. He bought the suits. He bought the penthouse. And slowly, he bought into his own hype. Alice was pushed into the background. She became the supportive wife, the invisible engine keeping the Ferrari running. She tolerated his long nights, his sudden business trips to Milan and Tokyo, and his growing irritability. She told herself it was the stress of success. Then came Bianca. Bianca Vore was hired as a brand consultant for the company 2 years ago. She was sharp, ambitious, and hungry. She saw Julian not as a partner, but as a ladder. It started with late-night strategy sessions, then working dinners, and finally weekend getaways disguised as conferences. Alice wasn't stupid. She saw the credit card charges. She smelled the perfume, Chanel No. 5, decidedly not her scent on his shirts. But the crushing blow came 6 months ago. Alice had come to the office to surprise Julian for his birthday. She had walked past his executive assistant, opened the heavy mahogany doors and found them. They weren't working. They were planning a life without her. "I need to cut her loose before the IPO," Julian was saying, a glass of scotch in his hand. "If I divorce her after we go public, she gets half the stock. I need to do it now. We'll offer her a settlement, tell her the company is struggling." "And if she fights," Bianca's voice had purred, "she won't. Alice is weak. She hates conflict. She'll take the check and cry in the Hamptons." Alice had closed the door silently, her heart shattering into dust. But in that dust, something hard and sharp had formed. She didn't confront them. She didn't scream. She went home, wiped her tears, and called Sarah Jenkins the toughest forensic accountant and divorce attorney in the state. For 6 months, Alice played the role of the oblivious wife. Meanwhile, Sarah and her team were digging. They found the shell companies. They tracked the hidden assets. And then they found something else. Something biological. Back in the courtroom, the memory of that discovery made Alice sit straighter. "Mr. Kane, you may begin your opening regarding the assets," Judge Sterling stated. Marcus Kane stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense posits that Thorn Logistics is solely the result of Mr. Thorn's vision. Mrs. Thorn has not been an employee on record for 10 years. She has enjoyed a lavish lifestyle provided by my client. We are offering a lump sum of $2 million and the beach house. In exchange, she waives all rights to future earnings and stock options." $2 million. Sarah Jenkins shot up. "The company is valued at $4 billion. That is 0.05% of the marital estate." "A valuation based on future projections," Marcus countered smoothly. "Liquid assets are low. Mr. Thorn has significant overhead. And as noted, he has a new dependent on the way. A child who will require security." Julian nodded solemnly, looking at the judge. "I have to think of my son, Your Honor. Bianca is 7 months pregnant. I need to ensure his future is secure." "Your son?" Judge Sterling repeated, his eyes drifting to Bianca in the gallery. She smoothed her dress over her belly, looking appropriately demure. "Yes, Your Honor." Julian said, his voice thick with fake emotion. My legacy. It is interesting you speak of legacy, Mr. Thorne, Sarah Jenkins said, stepping out from behind her table. Because that is exactly what we are here to discuss. Not just the legacy of money, but the legacy of biology. Julian frowned. Objection. Relevance. Overruled, Sterling said sharply. I want to hear where this is going. Sarah walked to the center of the room. Mr. Thorne claims he needs to hoard assets for his unborn child. He claims this child is the reason he cannot provide a fair settlement to the woman who built his company from a kitchen table. But, Your Honor, if the premise of his financial hardship is the child, shouldn't we be certain of the child's parentage? Julian laughed a harsh, barking sound. Is this a joke? Are you implying Bianca is cheating? She's devoted to me? Unlike some people, she knows loyalty. He shot a glare at Alice. I am not implying anything, Sarah said calmly. I am dealing in facts, and the fact is, during the discovery phase, we found medical records that you, Mr. Thorne, seem to have forgotten about. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. What records? From 2018, Sarah continued. When you and Alice were trying to conceive, you visited the fertility specialist, Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation, just a coincidence. You underwent a series of tests. Julian's face went pale. He remembered the tests. He remembered being told everything was fine, or at least that's what he told Alice. He had been too busy to go to the follow-up appointment. He had just assumed the stress was the issue. I don't see how my medical history is relevant, Julian stammered, looking at Marcus for help. Marcus looked confused. Julian hadn't told him about this. It is relevant, Judge Sterling interjected, because the court ordered an independent verification based on the evidence submitted by the plaintiff last week. A verification that required a DNA sample from you, Mr. Thorne, which you provided during the paternity deposition for the other matter. Julian froze. He had given a swab 2 weeks ago, thinking it was just a formality for the custody agreement of the new baby. I have the results right here, Judge Sterling said, lifting the sealed envelope. The sound of the paper crinkling echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Bianca in the back row stopped smiling. She shifted in her seat, her eyes darting from Julian to the judge. Mr. Thorne. The judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You walked in here, holding that woman's hand, smiling as if you owned this court. You insulted your wife. You lied about your assets. But science does not lie. Sterling began to tear open the envelope. Judge Harrison Sterling didn't rush. He pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope, smoothed it out on the mahogany bench, and adjusted his spectacles. The silence in the room was so absolute that the hum of the HVAC system sounded like a jet engine. Julian Thorne was still standing, his knuckles gripping the edge of the defense table. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt since the early days of risking bankruptcy. He looked at Bianca. She was staring straight ahead, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. But Julian noticed a tiny bead of sweat tracing a path down her temple. Mr. Thorne. Judge Sterling began, his voice devoid of emotion. This document is a certified medical analysis from Helix Gen Labs dated October 24th of this year. It compares your DNA profile against the genetic markers required for paternity. And, Julian demanded, his voice cracking slightly, tell them it's my son. Tell them I need to protect my assets for my heir. The report, Sterling continued, ignoring the outburst, cross-references your sample with a medical diagnosis from 2018, which was subpoenaed by the plaintiff. That diagnosis made by Dr. Eris Thorne states that you suffer from a condition known as congenital bilateral absence of the vas deferens. The judge looked over his glasses, locking eyes with the billionaire. For those in the court not versed in medical terminology, Sterling said, his voice rising so the back row could hear, it means you were born without the tubes that carry sperm. Mr. Thorne, according to medical science, it is biologically impossible for you to father a child naturally. You have been sterile since birth. The words hung in the air like smoke. Julian blinked. Once. Twice. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. That's a lie. That's a mistake. We've been trying. Bianca is pregnant. Look at her. He pointed a shaking finger at his mistress. The test results are conclusive, Judge Sterling said, dropping the paper. 0.0% probability of paternity. Mr. Thorne, you are not the father of the child Ms. Vore is carrying. In fact, you cannot be the father of any child. Julian turned slowly toward the gallery. The arrogance that had armored him for the last hour stripped away, leaving a confused, terrified man. He looked at Bianca Vore. Bianca, he whispered. Bianca didn't look at him. She was gripping her purse, her knuckles white. She looked at the exit sign, calculating the distance. Tell him, Bianca! Julian pleaded, his voice rising to a shout. Tell him the doctors are idiots! Tell him it's mine! Bianca finally turned her head. Her eyes, usually warm and seductive, were cold and hard. The mask dropped. There was no love there. There wasn't even pity. There was only annoyance, the look of a gambler who realizes the horse she bet on just broke a leg. Oh, shut up, Julian, Bianca snapped. The gallery gasped. The sound was like a thunderclap. What? Julian recoiled as if slapped. I said, shut up, she hissed, standing up. You arrogant fool. Did you really think you were that virile? You're 45, and you drink like a fish. Of course it's not yours. Then, whose is it? Julian stammered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Bianca laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. Does it matter? It was a ticket to the penthouse, to the trust fund, to the life you promised me. But clearly your ex-wife is smarter than you are. She glared at Alice, who hadn't moved a muscle. Alice simply watched her expression, calm like a scientist, observing a chemical reaction she had predicted perfectly. You played me, Julian whispered, the reality crashing down on him. I bought you a condo. I transferred the Jagged Edge stocks to your name. I was going to leave everything to that boy. Well, you can ask the pool boy for the stocks back, Bianca sneered. I'm leaving. Officer Miller, Judge Sterling's voice boomed. Restrain the witness. No one leaves this courtroom until I say so. This hearing has just evolved from a civil asset division into a criminal inquiry regarding fraud. Officer Miller stepped in front of the swinging gate, blocking Bianca's path. She slumped back into the bench, crossing her arms, furious. Julian collapsed into his chair. He felt like he couldn't breathe. He looked at Marcus Kane, his shark lawyer. Marcus was frantically flipping through papers, his face pale. You knew, Julian said, turning to his lawyer. Did you know? No, Julian, I swear, Marcus stammered. I just handled the prenup. I didn't know about the medical history. But she did, Julian realized. He slowly turned his head to look at the plaintiff's table. Alice was looking right at him. For the first time in years, he truly saw her. She wasn't the mousy woman he had discarded. She was the woman who had built his algorithms. She was the one who solved problems. And Julian Thorne was the problem she had just solved. Order! Judge Sterling banged his gavel, silencing the murmurs that had erupted in the gallery. Mr. Kane, control your client, or I will hold him in contempt. We are not done. Julian sat there hollowed out. The revelation of his sterility did more than just destroy his relationship with Bianca. It shattered his self-image. He wasn't the virile king of industry. He was a cuckold, a fool, and everyone in the room knew it. Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins spoke up, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Now that we have established that there is no heir, and thus no need for the future family security fund that Mr. Thorne argued was necessary, we would like to address the matter of the marital assets. Proceed, Sterling said, leaning forward. Mr. Thorne's entire defense for offering my client a pittance was based on financial hardship due to his expanding family, Sarah said, walking toward the bench. Since that family is a fiction, we return to the prenup. Mr. Kane described it as ironclad. We agree. It is ironclad. Sarah pulled a thick document from her file. Clause 14. Section B, Sarah read aloud. The infidelity and good faith clause. It states that if either party engages in extramarital affairs that result in public scandal or financial misappropriation of company funds for a third party, the offending party forfeits their right to the primary shareholder status in Thorne Logistics. Marcus Kane shot up. Objection. That clause was boilerplate. It was never meant to. It was signed, Mr. Kane, Judge Sterling interrupted, and I believe bringing a mistress to court who then admits to paternity fraud in front of a judge qualifies as a public scandal. Furthermore, Sarah continued, relentless, we have evidence that Mr. Thorne transferred $3 million of company assets to a shell corporation controlled by Miss Vore in anticipation of this child. That is financial misappropriation. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot. I can fix it. I'll get the money back. Alice, please. We can settle this. Half. I'll give you half. Alice finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but in the acoustic perfection of the courtroom, it carried like a bell. I don't want half, Julian. Julian looked at her confused. What do you want? The house, the cars, take them. I don't want the things you bought, Alice said, standing up. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. I want what I built. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, 10 years ago, when Thorne Logistics was founded, the core routing algorithm, the Thorne protocol that makes the company worth billions, was written on my laptop. It was my code. That's a lie, Julian shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. I designed the logic, she just typed it in. Mr. Kane, Sarah Jenkins said, holding up a USB drive. This is the original source code, time-stamped and digitally signed by Alice Thorne 3 years before the company was incorporated. We also have emails from Mr. Thorne admitting he didn't understand how the recursive shipping loop worked and asking Alice to fix it before the investors see. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered those emails. He had been so lazy, so reliant on her genius. He never thought she would keep them. The prenup, Sarah continued, defines marital property as assets acquired during the marriage. But it defines intellectual property as belonging to the creator unless explicitly assigned. Alice never assigned the rights to the Thorne protocol to the company. She merely granted a revocable license. Sarah placed the USB drive on the judge's bench. As of this morning, Sarah said, turning to look at Julian with a smile that matched the one he had worn walking in, Alice has revoked that license. The room went dead silent again. Revoked, Julian whispered. You can't. The ships, the automated warehouses, the tracking systems, they all run on that protocol. If you revoke the license, the system shuts down, Alice finished for him. Within 24 hours, Thorne Logistics will be unable to route a single package. The stock will go to zero. Julian looked at Marcus. Marcus was shaking his head. She's right, Julian. If she owns the IP, she holds the kill switch. You don't have a company. You have a shell. Julian Thorne, the billionaire, the titan, the man who had walked in with a smile, realized he was standing on a trap door that had just opened. He wasn't losing half his money. He was losing his entire existence. "You can't do this," Julian pleaded, tears actually forming in his eyes now. "Alice, think of the employees. Think of the legacy." "I am thinking of the legacy," Alice said coldly. "My legacy. The one you stole. The one you tried to give to a mistress and a child that isn't yours?" Judge Sterling watched the exchange with a grim satisfaction. He picked up his gavel. "It seems the court has a very complex decision to make," Sterling said. "Mr. Thorne, you have committed perjury regarding your assets. You have misappropriated funds. And now it appears your company is built on stolen property." "Wait!" Julian screamed, standing up and rushing toward the plaintiff's table. "Alice, don't do this. We can work it out. I'll leave her. I'll fire Bianca. Just don't kill the company." Officer Miller stepped forward, his hand on his taser, blocking Julian. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," the judge roared, "or you will await my ruling from a cell." Julian stumbled back, falling into his chair. He looked at Bianca, who was looking at her phone, ignoring him completely. He looked at Alice, who was calmly packing her bag. "We are taking a 1-hour recess," Judge Sterling announced. "Mr. Thorne, I suggest you use that time to speak with your attorney about a very different kind of settlement. Because if I have to make a ruling based on the fraud I've seen today, you will leave this courtroom with nothing but the suit on your back, and frankly, I'm not sure you'll even keep that." The conference room adjacent to courtroom 4B smelled of stale coffee and impending doom. It was a small windowless box with a fluorescent light that buzzed incessantly, a sound that seemed to drill directly into Julian Thorne's skull. Julian paced the length of the room, his expensive Italian loafers squeaking on the linoleum. His jacket was off, thrown carelessly onto a chair. His tie was loosened. The confident billionaire who had strutted into court an hour ago was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. Marcus Kane sat at the table, his head in his hands. He was furiously texting his firm's senior partners, trying to figure out how to salvage his own reputation from this train wreck. "Stop pacing, Julian," Marcus snapped, not looking up. "You're making me dizzy." "Stop pacing." Julian spun around, his eyes wild. "She's going to kill the company, Marcus. She's going to turn off the lights." "Do you understand what that means? The stock drops to pennies. The board sues me. The SEC investigates. I go from the cover of Forbes to a prison cell in 6 months. "I told you," Marcus said, his voice rising. "I didn't know about the code. You told me you built the system. You said she was just a glorified secretary. I thought she was—" Julian roared. "She never asked for credit. She never put her name on anything. How was I supposed to know she kept the source code on a private drive?" The door opened. The room went silent. Alice walked in, followed closely by Sarah Jenkins. Alice looked calm, almost ethereal. She held a bottle of water in her hand, taking a slow sip as she surveyed the room. She didn't sit down. She didn't need to. She held all the cards. "You have 5 minutes," Sarah said, checking her watch. "Then we go back in and ask the judge to enforce the revocation of the IP license." Julian rushed toward Alice, stopping just short of grabbing her arm, when he saw the look in her eyes, a look of absolute indifference. "Alice!" Julian started, his voice trembling. "Baby, please. We can't let this happen. We built this. There is no we, Julian," Alice said softly. "There hasn't been a we since you missed my mother's funeral to go to a conference in Vegas. Do you remember that you sent flowers, orchids? My mother was allergic to orchids. You didn't even know." Julian flinched. I was busy. I was building our future." "No," Alice corrected him. "You were building your ego, and now you're going to pay for it." "I'll give you 70%. Julian offered, the desperation leaking from every pore. 70% of the assets. I'll keep the company, I'll keep the title, but you get the profits. Just let me keep the protocol running. Sarah laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Mr. Thorne, you don't seem to understand the leverage here. We don't want the profits. We don't want the money. Then what? Julian screamed. What do you want? Alice stepped forward. She looked at the man she had once loved, the man she had sacrificed her 20s for the man who had paraded a pregnant mistress in front of her to humiliate her. I want you to resign, Alice said. Julian froze. What? I want your resignation, Alice repeated, her voice steady. Effective immediately. You step down as CEO. You surrender your voting rights on the board. You transfer your controlling interest to me. You want the company, Julian whispered. You don't even like the business side. You hate the meetings, the press. I do hate them, Alice admitted. But I love the company. I love what it could be. And I'm not going to let you drive it into the ground with your recklessness. You used company funds to buy a mistress a condo. You lied to shareholders about the IP ownership. You are a liability, Julian. I can't resign, Julian stammered. I am Thorne Logistics. It's my name on the building. We can change the name, Sarah suggested helpfully. I've always liked Alice Transport. If you don't sign, Alice said, her voice dropping an octave. I walk back into that courtroom. Judge Sterling grants the order. I revoke the license. The software stops. The trucks stop. The planes stay grounded. And by tomorrow morning you will be the CEO of a bankrupt crater. She slid a document across the table. It was a single page, a resignation letter already drafted. Sign it, Julian, Alice said. Or lose everything. Those are your only choices. Julian looked at the paper. He looked at Marcus, who gave a slight, defeated nod. There was no way out. The prenup he had relied on was his death warrant. The mistress he had flaunted was a fraud. The wife he had underestimated was the executioner. With a shaking hand, Julian Thorne picked up a pen. He felt like he was signing his own death certificate. He scrawled his signature, the ink bleeding slightly on the page. Done! He rasped, sliding it back. Are you happy now? Alice picked up the paper, checking the signature. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. No, Julian, she said, turning to the door. I'm not happy. I'm just finished. The courtroom seemed even colder when they returned. The gallery was buzzing with whispers. Word had spread that something massive was happening in courtroom 4B. Reporters were starting to filter into the back rows. Julian walked in like a ghost. He slumped into his chair, staring at the table. He was no longer the CEO of Thorne Logistics. He was just a rich man with a broken ego and a public humiliation to endure. But the humiliation wasn't over. Judge Sterling returned to the bench. I understand the parties have reached a settlement regarding the corporate assets. We have your honor. Sarah Jenkins said, submitting the resignation letter and the transfer of stock agreement. Mr. Thorne has agreed to step down from all executive positions and transfer controlling interest to Mrs. Thorne. In exchange, Mrs. Thorne grants a perpetual royalty-free license of the Thorne Protocol to the company, ensuring its continued operation. A gasp went through the room. The reporters in the back started typing furiously on their phones. Billionaire CEO ousted in divorce court. Very well, Judge Sterling said, looking at Julian with a mixture of pity and contempt. But we still have the matter of the paternity fraud and the financial misappropriation regarding Ms. Vore. Sterling turned his gaze to the gallery. Bianca Vore was still there, sitting in the back corner, guarded by Officer Miller. She looked bored, checking her nails. Miss Vore, Judge Sterling said, please approach the bench. Bianca stood up. She didn't look scared. She walked to the front with a sway in her hips that seemed entirely inappropriate for the gravity of the situation. "You have admitted that Mr. Thorne is not the father," Sterling said. "Yet you accepted nearly $3 million in gifts and transfers under the pretense that he was. That is fraud, Ms. Vore. Grand larceny, in fact." "It was a gift," Bianca shrugged. "He gave it freely. I never signed a contract saying the money was for the baby." "The court disagrees," Sterling said dryly. "But for the sake of the record, and to determine the extent of the conspiracy, the court orders you to disclose the true paternity of the child. Was there a co-conspirator? Was someone else helping you target Mr. Thorne's assets?" Julian lifted his head. He looked at Bianca. "Who is it?" he croaked. "Just tell me. Was it the trainer, the pool boy, who—" Bianca looked down at Julian. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. "You really want to know, Julian?" she asked. "You think it was some random guy. You think I'm just some loose woman." She laughed. "I didn't target you, Julian. I was assigned to you." "Assigned?" Julian frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't come up with the idea to seduce you," Bianca said, her voice dripping with venom. "I didn't know about the shell companies or how to hide the money. I needed help. I needed someone on the inside, someone who knew your accounts better than you did, someone who hated you just as much as I did." The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit that was sharper than Julian's. He had a calm, predatory confidence. He walked down the center aisle, ignoring the gasps of the crowd. Julian turned around. His eyes widened until they looked like they would burst. "Gavin," Julian whispered. It was Gavin Reed, the chief operating officer of Thorne Logistics, Julian's best friend since college, the man Julian had trusted to run the day-to-day operations while he was busy living the life, the man who had been the best man at Julian and Alice's wedding. Gavin walked right past Julian without even looking at him. He went straight to Bianca, placing a protective hand on her lower back. "It's okay, honey," Gavin said smoothly. "I've got it from here." "Gavin!" Julian stood up, knocking his chair over. What is this?" Gavin finally looked at him. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated loathing. "Sit down, Julian," Gavin said, his voice calm and professional, the same voice he used in board meetings. "You're the father," Julian screamed. "You my best friend." "Best friend?" Gavin scoffed. "Is that what you call it? I did all the work, Julian, for 10 years. I ran the logistics. I managed the personnel. I cleaned up your messes. And what did I get? You took the credit. You took the magazine covers. You took the bonuses. And you treated me like a glorified assistant. So you set me up." "We set you up," Gavin corrected, gesturing to Bianca. "Bianca and I have been together for 3 years. We knew you were weak. We knew your ego was your Achilles heel. So we gave you exactly what you wanted. A pretty girl to stroke your ego." "The pregnancy," Julian murmured. "Is mine," Gavin confirmed. "And the 3 million you transferred to her trust. That's in an account in the Cayman Islands that I control. It was my severance package, Julian, since I knew you'd never pay me what I was worth." Julian looked from Gavin to Bianca. The betrayal was total. His wife had taken his company legally. His best friend and his mistress had taken his dignity and his liquid cash. He had been played from every conceivable angle. "You're a thief," Julian spat. "I'll have you arrested." "For what?" Gavin smiled. "Accepting gifts. You signed the transfer orders, Julian. I have the documents. You were so busy showing off to Bianca, you didn't even read what you were signing. You authorized a consulting bonus for her shell company. It's all legal." Gavin looked at Judge Sterling. "Your Honor, as the biological father of the child, I am prepared to take full financial responsibility for Ms. Vore. We have no further need for Mr. Thorne's generosity." Judge Sterling looked at Gavin with a mixture of disgust and begrudging respect for the audacity of the scheme. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, "you may be clever, but you are standing in a court of equity. And while you may have outsmarted Mr. Thorne, you seem to have forgotten one thing." "And what is that?" Gavin asked smugly. "You assumed, Mr. Thorne would still be the owner of the company when the dust settled," Sterling said, gesturing to the plaintiff's table. Gavin frowned. He looked at Alice. "What do you mean?" Gavin asked, his confidence faltering for the first time. Alice stood up. She looked at Gavin, the man who had eaten at her table, the man who had pretended to be her friend while plotting with a mistress. "Hello, Gavin," Alice said pleasantly. "I suppose you haven't checked your email in the last 10 minutes. "What did you do?" Gavin demanded. "Julian resigned," Alice said, her voice sharp as a whip. "I am the majority shareholder and CEO of Thorne Logistics now." Gavin's face went pale. "So I'm the COO. You need me. I run the operations." "Actually," Alice said, picking up a piece of paper from her file, "that was the first thing I did as CEO. I fired you." You can't," Gavin stuttered. "I just did," Alice smiled. "For cause. Corporate espionage and conspiracy to defraud a shareholder, which means your stock options cancelled, your severance voided. And that company car you drove here, I'm having it towed right now." Gavin looked at Bianca. Bianca looked at Gavin. The severance package they had stolen was $3 million. But without his job, without his stock options, and with the lawsuits Alice was sure to file, Gavin was ruined. "And regarding that $3 million, Sarah Jenkins piped up, "since it was obtained through fraud, we will be filing an immediate freezing order on that Cayman account. You won't be able to buy a diaper, let alone a getaway ticket." The trap had snapped shut, not just on Julian, but on the vultures who had been picking at his bones. The chaos in courtroom 4B had reached a fever pitch. Gavin Reed, usually the picture of corporate composure, was now red-faced, screaming at his lawyer on the phone. Bianca Vore, realizing the gravity of the asset freeze, had physically recoiled from Gavin. "You said it was secure," Bianca shrieked, her voice cracking. "You said the Cayman account was untouchable. It was—" Gavin yelled back. "Until she took over the company, she has the corporate authorization codes. Now she can flag the initial transfer as theft." "So you have nothing?" Bianca asked, her eyes narrowing. "No job, no stock, no $3 million. I have my savings," Gavin stammered. "We can fight this. Who?" Bianca laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "There is no we, Gavin. I'm not raising a child in a rental apartment with a disgraced executive. Call me when you win the lottery." She turned on her heel and marched toward the exit, leaving Gavin standing there, mouth agape, holding the bag of a conspiracy that had just exploded in his face. Judge Sterling banged his gavel one final time. The sound was like the final nail in a coffin. "This court is adjourned," Sterling declared, his eyes lingering on Julian. "Mr. Thorne, the paperwork for the divorce is final. You are a single man. You have no alimony obligations as your ex-wife has waived them. However, I am referring the testimony of Ms. Vore and Mr. Reed to the district attorney's office for investigation into fraud and embezzlement. I suggest you stay close to your attorney." Julian Thorne sat alone at the defense table. The room slowly emptied. The reporters rushed out to file their stories. The gallery cleared. Gavin had been escorted out by Officer Miller to discuss the towed vehicle. Finally, only Julian and Alice remained. Alice packed her briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. She snapped the lock shut, click, click, and stood up. She looked immaculate, strong, and entirely out of his league. Julian stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He walked over to the railing. He wanted to scream, to beg, to rage, but all he had left was a hollow emptiness. "Alice," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. She stopped. She didn't turn her body toward him, just her head. Her eyes were clear, free of the tears that had stained her face for the last year. "What will you do?" Julian asked. It was a stupid question, but he didn't know what else to say. "I'm going to the office," Alice said simply. "I have a lot of work to do. The code needs to be updated. The rebranding starts tomorrow. Thorn Logistics is dead. We're calling it Phoenix Systems." "Phoenix," Julian repeated, rising from the ashes. "Exactly," she said. "And me." Julian asked, a pathetic note of hope in his voice. "What happens to me? I built that company, Alice. I was the face. People love me." Alice finally turned to face him fully. She looked at him with a pity that was far worse than hatred. "People loved the image we created for you, Julian," she said softly. "They loved the success. But the money is gone. The title is gone. The wife is gone. And your best friend and mistress just showed you exactly how much they loved you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a single crisp $10 bill. She placed it on the railing in front of him. "What is this?" Julian stared at the money. "Cab fare," Alice said. "It's a long walk back to Queens. That's where you started, isn't it? Maybe you can find yourself again there. Because the man standing here, I don't know him at all." Alice turned and walked out of the double doors. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the marble floor, a sound of progress, of moving forward. Julian watched her go. He looked down at the $10 bill. He looked around the empty courtroom that had been the stage for his destruction. He had walked in a billionaire, a husband, a father-to-be, and a king. He picked up the bill. He walked out into the cold November rain, a man with nothing but a cheap suit and the bitter taste of a justice he never saw coming. 1 year later, the giant digital billboard in Times Square flashed a new image. It was the cover of Fortune magazine. The headline read, "The Silent Architect Speaks Alice Thorn and the Rise of Phoenix Systems." On the street below, a man in a faded windbreaker paused to look up. He had a graying beard and tired eyes. He was holding a stack of flyers for a discount electronics store. Julian stared at the screen. Alice looked radiant, powerful, happy. "Hey buddy, keep moving," a pedestrian grumbled, bumping into him. "You're blocking the sidewalk." "Sorry," Julian muttered. I used to know her." "Yeah, sure you did, pal." The stranger laughed, walking away. "And I used to be the King of England." Julian watched the screen for one more second, then turned his collar up against the wind. He disappeared into the crowd, just another anonymous face in the city he once thought he owned. And that is the story of Julian Thorn, the billionaire who thought he could buy everything, only to realize that the most valuable things, loyalty, love, and truth, aren't for sale. He walked in with a smile, but he walked out with a lesson that cost him everything. It's a brutal reminder that when you build a life on lies, the truth will eventually knock it down. Alice didn't just get revenge, she got justice. She took back her power not by screaming, but by being smarter, stronger, and patient. Now I have a question for you. If you were Alice, would you have left Julian with absolutely nothing, or would you have given him a second chance? Was the punishment too harsh, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I read every single one, and I'm dying to see whose side you're on. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please smash that. Like button it really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on the next dramatic story. We have a crazy one coming up next week about a lottery winner who hid the ticket from his wife. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and remember, the truth always wins. See you in the next one.